I'll tell you just in one sentence what I do, because it leads a little bit into the conversation today. I'm not pulling this out to tweet. Unfortunately, I'm pulling it out just because it's my own little stopwatch. I run a new program at the Monk School Global Affairs, which is part of the University of Toronto, which, you know, in its other parts actually teaches folks how to have global careers of various sorts, private sector, public sector, NGO sector, and so on. The program that I run is a journalism program where we actually recruit people who already have advanced knowledge of a discipline, either as professionals or scholars, usually at a sort of early to mid-level in their career. And we teach them how to be journalists covering that discipline for media around the world, typically as freelancers. And we've had a number of folks who've come out of the NGO sector. And typically what we're finding is that media companies are desperate, actually, to break out of their own walls that they've had for a long time and actually engage people who are not conventional journalists in deepening an honest understanding of the world around them. And it's in that spirit that I want to actually bring some of these ideas to you. Because I think that, you know, we've typically, we've gotten really used to the conversation about media, which is one of despair. And particularly if you're talking about those big three that Marcus mentioned, the Globe, the Star, CBC, all of which, and National Post, I'll add to that. I'm big fans of all of them. We're actually very lucky in this city to have that kind of constellation of main media. But you'll know through your own work, and given that most of you are communications professionals, that it's harder to get through. It's harder to actually engage an editor because there are fewer of them. It's harder to engage a reporter because there are fewer of them and they're not on their beats anymore. And the beat reporter you may have known for 15 years has now been laid off or running corporate communications somewhere. And so it just feels harder and harder and harder. And actually, I think that I don't just want to speak from the perspective of hope, because I actually think that, you know, hope is a bit of a forecast. I actually think that there's a current set of circumstances that allow us to do our work more effectively with media right now, that actually allow us to move beyond the world where we were just pitching ourselves and pitching one story here, one story there, and a celebrity here or a big event there. Move beyond that world to actually work with media, partner more deeply with media, to deepen, this is my definition of journalism anyway, to deepen an honest understanding of the world around us. I think that's increasingly possible under the circumstances that we're currently facing. I'm taking the liberty of saying us because I come from a little bit of this world too. I mean, Alan talked a little bit about my background, and I won't really go into it other than to say, you know, I've done this work for the University of Toronto as Assistant VP of Communications here. I've done this kind of work in politics, which is different, obviously, than the civil society sector, but there's some commonalities. And I've done the work on a couple of boards in the Jewish community where I live and breathe the rest of my time. And I think what all of these different kinds of institutions have in common, and have in common with the NGO sector, the not-for-profit sector, is what distinguishes us from the private sector, where I've also worked. The private sector focuses its communications on the products and services it sells. And they may now add increasingly a patina of issue-related communications, but it is really quite straightforward. It's on the products and services that it sells. Our sector, the not-for-profit sector, very broadly defined, focuses our communications on two things, actually. One is the products and services that we deliver, and the other is the issue in which those products and services are embedded. We can't actually talk just about what we deliver. We also talk and advocate often for the issue. And that distinguishes us from the private sector, and also makes some of these different sectors consistent with one another. The big thing that it does is it creates an element, an environment of trust around our work. And so I want to set two kinds of context before I get directly into the 5 ideas. I'll refrain from calling them 5 good ideas. I'll let you be the judge of whether they're good or not, or maybe 2 of them are good and 3 of them are bad, but I'll just say 5 ideas anyway that I'm bringing to you. But I want to set 2 kinds of context. And the first one is actually about trust, which is, I think, where we live and breathe our daily work in this room. You know, trust, obviously, it's a word that we throw around, and we all understand that it is a vital premise of our ability to work in our communities. But it's even more than that as a business driver. It isn't just the basis on which we do our work. Trust is also the basis on which we are able to innovate. We can only take risks if we've generated trust. And actually, if you think of it from a business point of view, trust is directly correlated to your ability to take risk. in your ability to innovate. You can't innovate in service delivery unless you have the core trust of your stakeholders, your client base, the ministry, if you're sort of in a regulated kind of environment, et cetera, et cetera. The less trust you have, the less you can innovate. The less you innovate, the farther behind you fall. So trust is a fundamental driver of innovation. The other interesting thing about trust is that it's dynamic. And we know this intuitively, right? That societies become more trustworthy or less trustworthy. Certain institutions become more trusting or less trusting. Certain institutions become more trustworthy one year and then less trustworthy the next year and then more trustworthy the year after that. There's actually a flow. It's not just a static idea here. And there are a couple of places that actually measure this, interestingly, and have generated some data that are particularly relevant as a context for this conversation. You know, the Pew Foundation in Washington actually looks at some of these questions on a global basis, and they have the Pew Global Values Survey every year, which is interesting. Probably a little too broad for this conversation. The one that I wanted to bring to you, but it's worth looking at, and it's sort of a good trigger, you know, in your board meetings or wherever to talk about what are the bases of trust and the changing values of our country, among others. The one I want to bring to you, though, was the Edelman Trust Survey. And it's one of the resources that I've listed out in the 5 resources that I was asked to give you guys. Edelman, the PR company, goes out and actually interviews you know, thousands of people in 27 countries around the world, and effectively they ask, it's an 80-some-odd questionnaire, but basically they ask, which of these organizations do you trust the most? And there are 4 types of organizations: NGOs, and I would include the not-for-profit sector as NGOs. I know these are different terms with different meanings, but I'll include you as NGOs. So NGOs, media, government, and business. And it changes year to year, and I'll give you the latest. These are 2015, so this study must have been done sort of fall of 2014. But the latest for Canada look like this. The NGO sector, your sector, ranks the highest. 67% of Canadians surveyed, I mean, you know, obviously take this with a big grain of salt, because it's impossible to put a hard number on a question like trust, but I think directionally it's informative. 67% say that they trust NGOs, and that's the same number as last year. Media, my sector, or my other sector, has collapsed, really. In a year, they've gone from 58% of Canadians saying that they trust media last year to 47%. And that, by the way, is before the whole Adrian Lang business. And depending on when the survey was done, it may even have been before the whole Jian Ghomeshi business. That's just core stuff. 8 to 47% drop. Government, stable, actually, interestingly, at 49%. Government is now more trustworthy to Canadians than media. Wasn't last year, is apparently this year. And business has gone from 62% in Canada down to 47%. So business, government, and media all cluster around 47, 49. NGOs are at 67. So you can feel good about yourself. But there's a little vulnerability here that some of the global data suggest. In the US, actually, the number's gone up. It's gone up from something like 58 to 62, so same rough ballpark, but there's a sense that one can trust NGOs, maybe a little less in the States than in Canada, maybe because they're more partisan in the States than they are here. But in the UK, which is not that dissimilar to Canada in a lot of ways, in the UK, the trust level for NGOs in this last year has gone from 67% to 51%. The report, as I read it, didn't explain why. My suspicion and my sort of hypothesis is that as NGOs, as the not-for-profit sector does more and more of the work of government, in service delivery and advocacy, even in regulatory functions, if you're talking about things like certification groups, as NGOs do the work of government, they also attract the kind of critique, skepticism, well-nigh cynicism that government has always attracted in the past, with the added vulnerability of the fact that you cannot vote an NGO out of office. An NGO actually, at its worst, is an autocratic project by a couple of board members who want to advance an agenda. That kind of thing happened in the partisan world in the United States. So the net result here, the picture that you come away with is NGOs are the most trustworthy of these 4 kinds of institutions in Canada. The trust is somewhat vulnerable, potentially, if we take the UK lesson. And most interestingly for this conversation, media trustworthiness, if you will, has actually collapsed. So it starts to set up an interesting partnership. In other words, media need you. They may not know it. They may not be coming and knocking on your door. Even if they saw these data, they may not draw this conclusion. But the fact is that they need to enhance their basis of trust. You are the most trustworthy sector of the Canadian society. They need you. There's a natural partnership here. And there's a natural risk, which is that your trust is sufficiently vulnerable that in joining with media, you may actually reduce everything down to their level, or our level, I should say. I'll wear the hat of media. When actually what should happen is you should raise everything up to your level and even raise your level even higher through that partnership. And that leads to the second dimension of the context here. So I just want to make sure I keep my eye on the clock, and this thing sort of phases out. There you go. So in order to manage that relationship with media, before we get to our 5 ideas, in order to manage the relationship with media, you got to understand a little bit about why trust in media has collapsed the way that it has. I actually, it won't surprise you to know, I'm a journalist, I'm an editor, I run a journalism program, I partner with these media. I truly, truly believe in the integrity of journalism and in media. I think that these are really good people trying to do the very best job they can. I think that there's a lot of great stuff going on. And I think that if you picked up this weekend's Globe and Mail or Toronto Star, National Post, you would have actually deepened your honest understanding of the world a little bit, I think. If you picked up this month's Atlantic, you would have really deepened your honest understanding of the world. There's some fantastic stuff in there in my mind, but that was reading. But media is caught in what accountants call a death spiral. Okay, and a death spiral, when I went to business school after reporting for the Wall Street Journal for 6 years, I went to business school, did my MBA, and I didn't understand anything. Like truly, I didn't understand anything except for this term death spiral. It just made sense to me. Death spiral is what happens when a company or an industry that has huge overheads, that's built up these big overheads in order to compete, suddenly loses its market. Market goes away, you have to spread this cost of these big overheads over a smaller market, you make less money, et cetera, et cetera. I'll spell it out to you in some more detail. Media in Canada, in the States, and Western Europe emerged in the same way that heavy industry did through the last 100 years. It was a scale business. It's always been a scale business, just like airlines, auto manufacturers, the banks even. It's been a scale business. And what that's meant is that if you're the first guy on the block, and I don't use the term guy I'm using it in a gender-neutral way, so I'll just put that little caveat. But if you're the first player on the block, and you're the first one to grab the downtown real estate for your newsroom, first one to grab the big printing presses downtown, first one to get the union contract with the guild, which is a newspaper guild, plus the steel workers who are running your mills down in the basement, first one to get the fleet of trucks, and most importantly, first one to pay up to get all the advertisers. By pay up, I mean like not bribing them, but taking them out to the lunches and the hockey games and all that. If you're the first one on the block to spend all that money, first one to get the paper contract and all of that, then you can amortize those costs, all those fixed costs, over a growing market. As long as the city's growing and more people are buying the paper every day or more people watching TV, you can amortize that over a growing number of units sold, and pretty soon you've paid it all off, and then it's all profit. And the next guy can't come in, because if the next guy comes in, he now has to pay even more for each of those inputs, and there's less of a market for him to tap into that's left over. That's why in most of North America, and Toronto's an exception to this, but in most of North America, there is only one city paper, right? The big exception, even Washington has one city paper, really. I mean, there's a small second one, but Washington has one city paper. LA is the LA Times. There are other little players, but really effectively it's a one newspaper town. The exceptions to this in North America are Toronto and New York, and Montreal for language reasons. But they're built to scale, and that is great as long as the market keeps growing. But as soon as the market fragments, splits apart, starts to decline, you now have to amortize all of those huge fixed costs over a smaller number of units that you're selling. That means you make less profit per unit. Less profit you make per unit, less I can invest back in the product. The product gets a little worse. I sell less of it. I make less. I have to amortize those costs over even fewer units sold. I make less profit, et cetera, et cetera. It starts to go back. I invest less. I sell less. I invest less. I sell less until I am spreading my costs over such a small number of units that I am selling at a loss, and that is exactly what's happening now. So if you look at the financials for Torstar, Post Media, which owns the National Post, and every sort of major city paper in English Canada, except for Winnipeg and a couple other places, and Globe and Mail is not public. Globe and Mail's always sort of bounced around break even, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're in this boat too. That's exactly what you're seeing. It's why you're seeing it also at CBC. And so this is the world, right? The world that we're now in is a world where you have trust. They're losing trust because they can't invest that much more. And the old way, last thing I'll say about that context is that the old way, or sorry, the wrong way, I would say, the wrong way to break out of this death spiral is to stick with your rigid structure that you've always had and just have less in that rigid structure. In other words, if you're a newspaper, to keep all of the, to keep the idea of having a full-time reporting staff, that's all you have. I put out my whole paper, my whole newscast with a full-time reporting staff. I'm just going to have fewer of them. That's the wrong way out. That perpetuates the death spiral because then your product gets worse and worse and worse. The right way out that most businesses that have faced this, like in the auto sector, realize is to get out of the fixed costs altogether, or as much as you can, or no longer depend on that to make your business, to make your margin, and instead start doing partnerships, get into variable costs, flexible costs, so that I can actually track my market as it goes. My market goes down, I spend a little less. I'm keeping my margin. I can always reinvest in the product. That's the way out. Now I'm going to go out of this esoteric world of a business conversation, bring it back to us. Because this is the right way for these media companies to go, and they're starting to realize this is partnerships, real partnerships. Not a kind of partnership where you buy an ad supplement and we call that a partnership, a real partnership, where someone outside the newsroom is providing core content, but in a responsible way, not in an advertorial kind of way, in a responsible way that, to go back to my definition of journalism, deepens an honest understanding of the world around us. And so now I'm going to give you my 5 ideas. And my assumption for all of them is that no one in this room has extra money, and no one in this room has extra time. So these are not 5 ideas to, go and get more budget, fundraise for more communications budget, and then actually have a great new product and do something. No. This should leverage, I hope, with maybe, an extra half hour of work here or there kind of thing, optimistically, he says. This should leverage what you do already, particularly, and I was actually excited to see that there are a lot of folks in communications functions who are here, and I hope joining online as well, because one of our early conversations, Alan, was that a lot of not-for-profit organizations simply don't even have the resources to have a dedicated communications function. And so, in fact, I see a couple of sighs around the room, and I imagine that reflects some of the realities I hear too. So my ideas, I hope, they're really designed in my mind to serve the organizations that don't have much of a dedicated communications function, and for those that do, hopefully even better. And I'm going to do them in a slightly different order than whatever you may have on the paper in front of you. I'm going to go with my second one first. The first 2 of the ideas are strategic, and then the next 3 are sort of tactical. The first one I'll say is do deals. That's the first idea. Do deals. What is a deal? A deal is not buying a package of ads in a newspaper and calling that a partnership. A deal is basically identifying the core, first of all, identifying the audience that you really need to influence for your advocacy or your service delivery or whatever that may be, with some degree of precision. Right? So we're not talking about, saying that all decision makers in Canada are my audience. No. What industry is your audience? What level of what industry is your audience? Right? Decision makers in what community, in what ethnic community or what geographic community. So first, identifying the audience very clearly. And then understanding which media serve that audience. Which media, most importantly, live and breathe that audience. And by the way, it is not CBC, the Globe Mail, and the Toronto Star. CBC, the Globe Mail, and Toronto Star, God bless them, and truly, I'm going to say it again, I really admire all 3 of these. They don't live and breathe any single audience. That's not their job. Right? The Globe will say, we live and breathe Bay Street, we live and breathe. No, Bay Street is too diverse. They don't live and breathe any single audience. They are mass media. But there are media out there that live and breathe the audiences, whatever it is, the audiences that you're actually trying to influence. So identify those. And remember about the big guys too. We'll get to that in a second. So once you've identified your audience, and once you've identified the media that are serving that audience, this is all still in the first idea, I hope that's okay, figure out how you can add value to that medium. How you can add value to that newsletter, to that weekly, to that website, to that podcast, to whatever that may be. What information do they need about your sector that you have? You just have it. You have the data, it comes in every week or every month. What information do they need that you have that you can provide to them? I'll give you an example that actually comes out of my cohort last year in the Fellowship in Global Journalism. And I don't know if it would have been the right kind of example, but it just comes to mind. One of my fellows last year was research director at the Daily Bread Food Bank. And because it's not a world I've had much to do with, I think there's someone here from Daily Bread. Is that right? Is there? Or I think someone may be RSP. Anyway, I was not aware that Daily Bread Food Bank generated enormous amounts of data on poverty in Toronto and Ontario. They're a wellspring, they're a think tank, in addition to being a service delivery organization. Well, they have a ton of data that they can provide more regularly, if they wanted, than their annual, once or twice annual report on food banks. If they identified the media partner that actually needed that data weekly or monthly, the Daily Bread Food Bank report on whatever, right? A little poverty index, something like that. They could actually provide that. That's the kind of partnership I'm talking about. And it will be different for everyone. There are all sorts of, I know that there are some environmental not-for-profits here, some arts not-for-profits here. It'll be different for everyone, but you can start to imagine what that might be. That's the kind of deal we're talking about. Second idea, which builds, and these all build, these aren't sort of like either or, I sort of built them cumulatively. So it's the second idea, the second dimension of this strategy, is to identify a portfolio of media that you want to be working with in this regard. Okay, so this is getting out of our heads that the world comes down to. I'm so glad you put it that way, Marcus, because it's exactly the way that I've encountered that framework over and over and over again in my work in communications. That we either get the message out in Metro Morning or the Toronto Star or it's dead, right? And at best, if you do that, you might get one play. Right? A play on Metro Morning at 7 is fantastic, if the people you're trying to reach happen to be in their cars at 7 listening to Metro Morning. But if they have to drop off their kid a little earlier at school and they're not in their cars at 7, or if someone, in the case of my house this morning, actually threw up at exactly 7 and I'm not listening to Metro Morning, and then again at 7:15 and again at 7:30, you're going to miss them, right? So these are great big media, but the real point is actually to identify a portfolio of media. And the way that I talk about it with freelancers is think of, and we just talked about it, right? Identify the audiences you're trying to get to. Identify the professional or the trade or the industry press. And I don't mean press just, paper press. I mean, media that caters to those audiences, that lives and breathes those audiences. Identify the ethnic media that lives and breathes the community that you have to get to. Identify the geographic media that lives and breathes the agenda that you're trying to set. Identify those, and they will need you. And they're not going to be overwhelmed like the one editor, the star, the one assistant producer at Metro Morning is like 5,000 calls who all want to get on the show. These are guys who are sitting, no one's calling them. They have to fill something every week or every day if it's a website. And you call them and say, I can actually give you content regularly, because I've now thought this through and I have some proposals for you. Holy smokes, how much do I have to pay? And your answer is nothing, which by the way is part of the deal. Don't ask for money, because they don't have any. What you might do, this is a bit of a side, but what you might do is actually create something of enough value that they could even sell some advertising against it, in which case you should split the revenue. But don't ask them to pay. It's a gimme, right? We're all in this together. We're all serving this community together. Suddenly they need you, and you have that partnership, right? You know who's done this, actually? Is Stephen Harper. Stephen Harper realized back when he was in the opposition that he could avoid the National Press Gallery in Ottawa altogether, and it didn't matter. Because as soon as Harper called up a local reporter in Kamloops or in Chester, Nova Scotia, they would fall all over the place to speak to him, even when he was just leader of the opposition. Holy smokes, the big guy from Ottawa wants to speak to me, and that's been his whole media strategy. It's been brilliant. The Liberals, my old shop, keep trotting out to speak to the same 5 worthies at the Globe Mail, the CBC, and the National Post, and the press gallery. And Harper, and they boycott Harper, not because they're Liberals, but because Harper doesn't treat them very well. He said, fine, I'll get on a plane and I'll go speak to the Calgary Herald. They'll be happy to talk to me. And if it's not Calgary, I'll go to Saskatoon and speak to the Leader Post. They'll be happy to speak to me. Do the same thing. Forget about the big guys for the moment. Build up to them, but most importantly, develop a portfolio. So you don't just have a partnership with one place. You have a partnership with a portfolio of places that live and breathe the same group that you want to get to. So that's the strategy. We'll get into the last 3 here, which are executional. Once you have that notion of a partnership and you have some sense of the information that you can bring to a partner that they don't have, that they need, and you've picked the right 2 or 3 or maybe even 4, you then actually need to service those guys. And you need to do it, if I go back to that basic assumption, you need to do it without any extra money and with really, no extra time. I mean, okay, maybe a bit of extra time, but not a whole FTE or half FTE's worth of time. You need to start thinking a little bit like a leveraged kind of newsroom. What is that? Well, when you have your staff meeting, or your board meeting, or if you have a stakeholder committee or something like that, that's a newsroom. These are people who are tapped into the issues as they're seeing them coming up before anyone at your partner sees them. So you add 10 or 15 minutes on to one of those meetings, and you look for the ideas. Now, your relationship, your partnership with that media partner may be on a whole bunch of different formats. It may be that you generate data, and I'm just going to give you these data every month. I don't need to do this because it's just a matter of giving you the data I've always kept in-house and never thought much about. But if the partnership involves actually thinking of new story ideas all the time, then you can do that in your meeting. And you add 10 minutes, and you basically look for story ideas that meet 3 of the following 4 criteria, right? And this is basically how I teach journalists how to find interesting stories. The story, only 3 of these 4 are enough. It should be something that is important to the audience that you're targeting, not just important to you, but important to the audience that you're targeting. It should be timely. Okay, so it's actually something that's coming up. It should be relevant, I actually said, so it should be important, it should be, so maybe just 3. It should be important, it should be timely, and it should hopefully be sort of counterintuitive. Because if it's just conventional wisdom, I'm not all that interested. But if there's something that I hadn't expected, right? So first, I go back to the Daily Bread Food Bank stuff. Last year, we were looking at some stories that our fellow brought to us. And he's saying, you know, our data show that actually we've sort of, I mean, these are my words, not his, but we've sort of figured out families. Surprisingly, that's surprising, first of all. What we haven't figured out is single men. Families are getting more food, like their poverty ranks are actually, I may be wrong with this, it's been a year since we looked at this story, but we've sort of, there's a changing face of poverty here. Our data are showing us that families are moving out, but single men are moving in. And our whole system is structured around families, and so we now have to ask questions. That's counterintuitive. It's also new. And at the time, it was around Christmas, it was timely. So if you're constantly looking for new ideas on those 3 criteria, right, counterintuitive, timely, and relevant to your audience, then in 10 minutes, if you designate one person at the staff meeting or the board meeting to sort of have that little rubric in front of her or him and actually take those ideas down and make sure the conversation happens, you'll get stuff, I promise you. And then we get to the last 2 ideas. Either you just bring those ideas to your partner, if that's part of the partnership. I'm going to just give you story ideas every month or every week or whatever it may be. And by the way, they're not just about my organization, okay? Very important, by the way, here. There's an ethical piece to this. The ethical piece is that if all you are doing is promoting the things going on in your organization, you're not serving the audience, you're not serving the media, you're just serving yourself. You can embed that stuff in some of the things you get. By the way, you should know that we're also having this funder coming up. Or by the way, you should know that we've just announced this new program. But if that's all you're doing, you're serving yourself, you're not deepening an honest understanding of the issue. That's the ethical piece to think about. But you'll get those ideas at your weekly meeting or your monthly or quarterly board meeting, whatever that may be. If that's all your deal is, then great. But if your deal is also to actually provide them with the content, then you could start to train your staff. And this is the 4th idea. You train your staff to actually be journalists in the same way. We're not talking about, like, you know, Glenn Greenwald kind of journalists who are breaking big investigative pieces. It probably wouldn't be in your interest anyway. We're talking about, in the same way that we train staff to have first aid, but not to be paramedics, much less nurses or doctors, you can train staff to do the basics of journalism. And in a nutshell, and I'm happy to sort of go into more depth individually, or if in your organizations you want to chat more about this, I'm always very happy to do that too. But in a nutshell, all someone has to do once they're on a story like this is to write a paragraph that says, this is why it's important. It's called a nut graph, basically. In a nutshell, this is why this is important. Give me a little bit of background to the whole issue, because assume that I don't know anything about this issue. I'm in the Jamaican community, but I've never heard about a food bank, so I don't know what food banks are. So give me a couple of paragraphs of background. And then give me some evidence, 2 or 3 paragraphs of evidence about why what I'm saying is happening. And that's it. It's actually relatively straightforward. That's only one format. That's the written format. My guess is, having worked in a bunch of different kinds of organizations before, that there will be people, particularly folks who may be in your communications shops, who want this training, who just want training on different formats, or who may just even be teaching it themselves. If so, let them run with it. And let them be the journalist covering your issue and providing that stuff to your partner. And the last idea, and then that's it for me at this point, I think. The last idea is to This may push the envelope a little bit, depending on the kind of organization we're talking about, but to let your clients be journalists, okay? There are ethical considerations of both these. Let me just return back to number 4 here, letting your staff be journalists. The one ethical big flag I raise on that is to recognize that when your staff member is working as a journalist, she or he has to actually present themselves that way. If she's a service provider, if she's a social worker who is visiting people in their homes and delivering that service, she can't be interviewing the Alzheimer's patient and then just sort of saying, fine, that's on the record, I'm a journalist, I'm going to put that. No. They have to go in and present themselves to a competent person, say, I'm a social worker, but I'm also here and I'm trying to do a story for our website or for this, or more to the point, for this partner that we have. Can I speak to you in that capacity? And that may or may not be cool. And you have to determine that in your organizations, whether that's even acceptable. But in the places where it is, you should try. Recognizing that there's a power relationship that any staff member has with any client in any organization that has to be managed around this. We can talk more about that if you'd like. But in the final idea where you let your clients do the same thing and you basically give them maybe the same kind of template, see an issue in your community, right? You actually want to communicate it? Great. Here's what you need. Give me a first sentence that just says what it is. Give me a second paragraph that says why this is important. Now tell me just one paragraph, a little bit of background about the community, and now give me some evidence in 3 or 4 paragraphs about what's going on. That's it, that's enough. That's great. Or if that's not the format, if the format is a podcast, if the format is video, if the format is whatever, work in that format, right? I'll put that into our partner. That's how we're actually going to work. Obviously, there's a key ethical issue here, which is, if you're dealing with a vulnerable population, you can't do that. If you're dealing with people who might not understand the risks of presenting themselves in a certain way, you can't do that. They have an ethical obligation, too, to not just present themselves, but to actually try to deepen an honest understanding of the issue that they're describing and all of that, right? But if you can manage it, my guess is, and I think there are more and more folks, particularly in the First Nations communities, who are realizing this kind of work can be really empowering to marginalized people, really enfranchising, and for folks who've not had a voice to actually have a voice and have that voice supported by an organization and a media partner, that's pretty powerful stuff if it's managed properly and ethically. So those are the 5 ideas. I don't know if you want me to do deals, have a portfolio of clients, not just those big 3, be a newsroom, come up with ideas on those 3 sort of metrics that I had on a regular basis, train your staff to do journalism the way we train people to do first aid, and where it's appropriate, and only where it's appropriate, train your clients to do journalism the way we do first aid. And I think that's it. So I don't know if we now should go into how you would like to do this, Marcus, but those are my 5 ideas. You can decide if 1 or 2 of them were good. But thank you.